The great hall of the Galactic Council shimmered with light from 1,000 crystal panels suspended above the chamber. Delegates from 100 worlds sat in curved rows that rose in tiers like the steps of an ancient arena. The air carried. The faint scent of rare gases pumped in for the comfort of species that needed them. And the low hum of translators filled the silence whenever a speaker paused. Among this assembly of powerful alien leaders walked a man in dark blue uniform, trimmed with silver. His name was Captain Elias Ward, a representative of humanity, chosen not because he carried the strongest fleet or the most advanced technology, but because he carried something no other delegate would dare bring into this chamber. At his side, padded a dog, a tall wolf-like creature with black fur streaked with gray, amber eyes glowing in the light, and a stance that carried both calm confidence and primal danger. His name was Fenrir, and he was no ornament. He was family. As Elias walked forward to take his assigned seat, whispers echoed across the chamber. Many of the aliens leaned closer to one another, some covering their mouths with scaled hands or curling tendrils as they spoke. Some laughed openly, their voices sharp and cutting, as their translators converted the mockery into words every ear could understand. They called humans strange for keeping predators in their homes. They called the animal a primitive beast dragged into a place of diplomacy. They called Elias reckless for trusting his life to a creature with teeth instead of a weapon. A tall, Kurothian delegate with a body of shimmering plates leaned forward and spoke loudly enough for the chamber to hear. He asked if humans had come to prove themselves as warriors or as pet handlers. The words were followed by ripples of laughter. Harsh and cold, a delegate of the Zelvani, whose body resembled a bundle of coiling vines, asked if the council should provide a leash and a muzzle, for fear that the beast might mistake the chamber for a hunting ground. More laughter filled the hall. Elias sat, calmly, his hand resting lightly on Fenrir's shoulder. The dog did not bark, did not snarl, did not flinch. His ears flicked once toward the laughter, then returned to focus forward, his chest rising and falling with steady breaths. To the humans in attendance, this calm was familiar. The deep bond of trust between owner and dog that ran back through tens of thousands of years. But to the aliens watching, it was incomprehensible. They saw only a predator at rest, a danger waiting to strike, and they laughed at the recklessness. When the laughter subsided, the chair of the council, a massive being of the Arkan species, struck the crystalline gavel. He demanded silence and allowed Elias the chance to speak. Rising to his feet, Elias addressed the chamber. His voice was firm but steady, carrying across the translators into every language. He explained that Fenrir was not a weapon nor a decoration, but a companion, one of humanity's oldest allies, bred not through chains or cages but through loyalty and trust. He spoke of Earth's history, of wolves that once circled human fires, of hunters and guardians, of war dogs and rescue dogs, of seeing-eye dogs that guided the blind, and of children who slept safely with a dog curled at their feet. The aliens looked curious, but most still scoffed. The Kurothian delegate rose again and said that no advanced civilization should allow a predator into their homes, let alone their councils. He argued that it showed weakness, that humans leaned on lesser creatures for comfort instead of standing proud alone. Again, laughter filled the chamber. Elias did not argue further. He simply sat, resting his hand once more on Fenrir's fur. The dog shifted closer, pressing his shoulder against Elias's leg, and for a moment the noise of the hall seemed far away. It was a small reminder that in the heart of this mocking assembly, where every gaze was filled with ridicule, humanity had something the galaxy could not yet understand. The session moved on to trade discussions, border disputes, and the endless tides of diplomacy. But the eyes of the delegates often returned to Fenrir. They still whispered, still laughed quietly, still shook their heads at the absurdity of it. Yet not one dared step too close. Not one dared meet those amber eyes for more than a heartbeat, for something deep in their instincts stirred when they looked at him. Something ancient that whispered danger. Captain Elias Ward knew this was only the beginning. The galaxy mocked what it did not understand, but he also knew that someday soon they would see the truth. And when that day the bond explained. The following day the council gathered again in the chamber of light and crystal. The same aliens filled the seats, their expressions a mixture of amusement and irritation, for they had not expected the human delegate to return with the beast still at his side. Fenrir walked calmly, his gait steady and powerful, his eyes always scanning but his posture relaxed, as if he knew this place belonged to him as much as it did to Elias. The laughter began the moment Elias entered, though quieter than before, for some of the delegates remembered the way Fenrir's eyes had unsettled them. Still, the ridicule flowed like a steady current. The Zelvani delegate wrapped a coil of vines around the stem of a drinking vessel and remarked that humans must be lonely if they needed beasts for companionship. Another voice rang out, suggesting humans lacked courage without their pets to stand beside them. Elias reached his place and remained silent until the chair gave him permission to speak. He rose and placed a hand lightly on Fenrir's back, then looked around at the crowd. His voice carried firm clarity as he began to explain what the galaxy seemed determined not to understand. He spoke of the long ages of Earth when early humans hunted in groups, fragile compared to the great beasts that roamed the plains, yet clever enough to see in the wolves a mirror of themselves. He told them that humans and wolves formed a bond, not through force but through mutual trust, through shared struggle and survival. The wolves offered their teeth and their loyalty, the humans offered food, warmth, and protection, and together they endured storms and dangers that would have destroyed either alone. Fenrir sat tall, ears pricked, as though he understood his human was speaking of his ancestors. Elias's hand moved slowly across the fur at his neck while his words filled the hall. He told the council that over thousands of years, these wolves became dogs, companions to shepherds guiding flocks, guardians to villages under the moonlight, partners to hunters across wild forests, and friends to children who found comfort in their presence. He reminded them that when fire and flood struck human towns, it was often the dogs that braved danger to find the lost and lead rescuers to safety. He told of soldiers who marched into battle with loyal hounds at their side, not leashed by chains, but bound by love, and of explorers who crossed frozen wastes because dogs pulled their sleds through blizzards no machine could endure. The chamber grew quieter as Elias spoke, though not everyone accepted his words. The Corothian delegate interrupted, clicking his plated mandibles, and said that no creature that obeyed emotion could be considered equal to tools or weapons. To rely on them was weakness. Another delegate scoffed that sentiment had no place in the harsh affairs of galactic politics, but Elias answered with calm strength, saying that dogs were not weapons nor tools. They were proof that survival did not require conquest alone, that trust and loyalty were forces as powerful as fleets and armies. He pointed to Fenrir, who watched the room with steady eyes and asked the council if they saw weakness in that gaze. He said that to humans this animal was not a slave, but a partner, not a servant, but family. Fenrir did not protect him out of fear of punishment but out of love, and that kind of loyalty was something the galaxy could not buy, could not steal, and could not create in laboratories. It was forged only by centuries of companionship and sacrifice. The room fell into uneasy silence. Some shifted in their seats, their instincts prickling with the weight of the human's words. Yet still others laughed, though softer now, saying, humans were fools blinded by emotion. They claimed that love and loyalty would crumble when faced with true strength. Elias did not argue further. He returned to his seat, Fenrir lying down at his feet, head resting on his paws, tail curling around his body. As the counselors moved on to other matters of trade and border lines, a few kept glancing toward Elias and Fenrir. Some stared with unease, some with curiosity, and some still with scorn. But deep inside their minds, a question had begun to grow, though they refused to voice it. They wondered what such loyalty might mean if ever tested, what a creature like Fenrir might do if his human were truly threatened. Elias knew this question would soon find its answer, for peace in the galaxy was never as stable as it seemed. And when that test came, the galaxy would learn that humanity's bond with its so-called pets was no weakness at all, but something far more dangerous. A subtle threat, The council session stretched over several days, and Elias grew used to the rhythm of entering the chamber with Fenrir at his side, enduring the whispers and laughter that followed him like shadows. Yet outside the chamber, in the long marble corridors and the courtyards filled with strange alien plants, the atmosphere was different. Not all aliens kept their scorn confined to jokes. Some had begun to view the human delegate and his animal with growing resentment, believing that humanity had brought a dangerous symbol into the heart of diplomacy. Among these voices were those who already disliked humanity's presence in the council and saw an opportunity to weaken its standing. One evening after the session ended, Elias walked through the outer gardens where pools of glowing water reflected the distant stars. Fenrir padded beside him, alert but calm, his ears twitching as sounds drifted across the still air. A group of delegates lingered nearby, their forms partially hidden among the twisting trees. They spoke in hushed tones, but Fenrir's ears caught every word and his head turned slightly in their direction. Elias slowed his steps, pretending to admire the alien flowers, but he listened closely. The delegates belonged to a faction that had long resisted humanity's rise in influence. Their voices carried venom as they whispered about humiliation, about teaching the human a lesson. One of them hissed that the council was losing dignity by allowing a beast into its sacred hall. Another suggested that perhaps an accident might remind the human of his true place. They laughed softly, but the laughter was not like the mocking tone of the public chamber. This was sharper, crueler, and filled with intent. Fenrir shifted closer, to Elias, his muscles tightening beneath his fur. Elias rested a hand on the dog's neck and felt the steady tension, the readiness that came from instinct honed over millennia. He whispered softly, more to reassure his companion than himself, that they would not act here in the open. Still, he knew now that the laughter was only the surface of something darker. That night, Elias sat in his quarters overlooking the city of spires. Fenrir lay stretched across the floor near the door, his ears still flicking at every sound. Elias thought back to the words spoken in the garden and understood the danger was real. The council chamber might be full of rules and order, but the world beyond those walls was not. Rival powers wanted humanity silenced, and they saw him as an easy target. The next day passed with the usual tide of debates, trade arguments, and territorial disputes. Fenrir sat silently at Elias's feet while the alien spoke. Yet several times Elias caught the gaze of delegates who had whispered in the garden. Their eyes lingered on him, cold and calculating, then shifted quickly away. The laughter about his companion was quieter now, though not gone. Some still made jokes, but their eyes no longer matched their words. There was unease there, a shadow behind the scorn. That evening, Elias chose to walk again, but this time he followed a path along the outer walls of the council complex where fewer guards patrolled. He wanted to see if his enemies would reveal themselves. The city lights cast long shadows across the stone, and the distant hum of alien transports filled the air. Fenrir walked close, his eyes scanning every corner. It was there, among the dim corridors, that Elias heard footsteps not his own. From the shadows emerged figures cloaked in dark fabric, their faces hidden, their movements quick and precise. They spread out, blocking the path ahead and the way behind. One of them spoke with a mocking tone, asking if the human felt brave now that he had his pet beside him. Another sneered that without the council guards and the laws of diplomacy, he was nothing but fragile flesh. Elias did not answer. He kept his stance calm, his hand resting once more on Fenrir's shoulder. The dog stood rigid now, hackles rising, a low growl rumbling deep in his chest. The sound was not loud, but it carried the weight of ancient forests and the hunt of wolves long past. The figures hesitated at the sound, though they tried to laugh it off. One of them stepped closer, raising a weapon that glimmered in the faint light. He told Elias that it would be quick, that the galaxy would forget him soon. But the moment his foot pressed against the ground to advance, Fenrir's growl deepened, and his body coiled like a spring ready to unleash. Elias knew then that the aliens were about to learn the truth behind the bond they mocked, for Fenrir's loyalty was not words or sentiment, but an unbreakable vow written into his very blood. And in that tense silence, as the first threat sharpened into action, the laughter that had once filled the council chambers would soon be replaced with fear, the spark of violence. The night air was heavy with tension as the cloaked figures closed around Elias in the shadowed corridor. Their steps echoed against the stone walls, soft yet full of intent. The leader of the group lifted his weapon higher, its blade glowing faintly with alien energy, and his voice carried both confidence and contempt as he promised the human a quick end. Elias stood still, his body calm though his eyes measured every movement, his hand resting on Fenrir's back like an anchor. The dog's growl rumbled through the silence, deep and primal, a sound that made the nearest assassin hesitate, though pride forced him to stand his ground. The moment stretched thin like a drawn bowstring, and then it snapped. The nearest figure lunged forward, weapon raised to strike, but before the blade could fall, Fenrir moved. He exploded from Elias's side with a speed that blurred his outline, a streak of black and gray fur that crashed into the attacker with crushing force. The alien cried out as fangs tore into his arm, the weapon clattering to the ground. Fenrir's weight drove him to the floor where claws raked across his chest and the sound of snarling fury filled the corridor. The others rushed forward in panic, their weapons raised, but the sight of the beast tearing through their companion shook their confidence.
One swung a glowing blade at Fenrir, but the dog twisted with impossible speed, teeth flashing as he released his first victim and lunged at the second. His jaws snapped around the attacker's wrist, and with a violent shake, the weapon dropped,
Uselessly clattering across the stones. The alien screamed, falling to his knees, his tendrils writhing in pain as Fenrir released him only to leap at the next foe. Elias remained motionless, his eyes steady, for he knew Fenrir's instincts needed no command. The dog was not a tool to be directed, but a protector, acting from the deepest bond of loyalty. His movements were fluid, honed by nature and sharpened by centuries of partnership with humankind. He fought not like a mindless predator, but like a soldier trained for war. Each strike was precise, each lunge meant to disarm and disable, each growl a promise of death if the threat continued. The cloaked figures faltered, their formation breaking as fear gripped them. One tried to retreat, stumbling backward toward the shadows, but Fenrir's eyes caught the movement. In a blur, he was upon the fleeing alien, slamming him into the wall with a thud that rattled the stones. The assassin collapsed, gasping for breath, and did not rise again. The others hesitated, their weapons still raised but their courage draining away. They had mocked the human for keeping a beast as a companion, but in that moment they saw no pet, no fragile animal, but a force of nature, a predator unleashed in defense of its master. Fenrir returned to Elias's side, his fur bristling, his muzzle stained, his amber eyes burning with fire. He stood between Elias and the remaining attackers, his growl a steady warning. The assassins glanced at one another, their courage broken, and slowly they backed away. Their leader, clutching a wounded arm, spat words of hatred and swore this was not finished, but even his voice trembled as he spoke. They retreated into the shadows, leaving behind their injured companions and the silence of defeat. When the echoes of their footsteps faded, Elias knelt and placed both hands on Fenrir's strong neck. The dog's breathing was heavy but steady, his eyes still scanning the darkness for danger. Elias whispered softly that he had done well, his voice calm though his heart pounded with the weight of what had just occurred. For the first time, the mask of laughter and mockery had been ripped away, revealing the truth that the galaxy had refused to see. By the next morning, whispers filled the council halls. News of the attempted attack spread quickly, and with it, tales of the beast that had torn through trained assassins as if they were nothing. Delegates who once laughed now avoided Elias's gaze, their voices low as they spoke of what had happened. Some still mocked, claiming it was only luck, but their eyes betrayed the unease that clung to them. Others remained silent, for they had seen enough to understand that humanity's so-called pets were more than companions. They were guardians forged in loyalty and sharpened by love, and when threatened they became something the galaxy was not prepared to face. Elias walked into the chamber that day with Fenrir at his side as always. Yet the air was different now. The laughter had quieted, replaced by a hush that carried both fear and curiosity. Fenrir's paws clicked steadily on the stone floor, and each sound echoed like a warning. No one dared to block his path. No one dared to question his presence. The spark of violence had lit a fire that would not soon fade, and the galaxy had begun to realize that humanity's strength was not only in ships or weapons, but in bonds deeper than any they could understand. The fight unleashed. The morning after the ambush, the council chamber was unusually quiet. Delegates who once laughed openly now whispered in uneasy tones, their voices carrying fear more than mockery. Elias entered as he always did, shoulders straight, his steps steady, and Fenrir walked close at his side, the dog's eyes sweeping the chamber like a silent guardian. Every sound of claw against stone echoed louder than before, a reminder to all present of what had happened in the shadows of the city. When Elias took his seat, the chair of the council demanded order and asked for explanation. The leader of the faction that had plotted against Elias attempted to deny involvement, claiming ignorance, but the wounds carried by his assassins told another story. Several delegates had seen the cloaked figures stumble back into the night, torn and broken, and their silence now was heavier than truth. The chair allowed Elias to speak, and once again he placed his hand on Fenrir's fur and rose. Elias did not raise his voice, but the words carried into every corner. He said that humanity had been mocked for bringing predators into their homes, for allowing loyalty to tie them to animals, but the galaxy had now witnessed what that loyalty meant. He spoke of the attack, of how assassins armed and prepared had been stopped not by fleets or weapons but by a single dog who refused to let harm reach his human. He told them that Fenrir had not fought because of orders, nor because of fear, but because love had made him fearless. The chamber shifted uneasily. Some delegates looked away, their eyes haunted by instinctual recognition of predator and prey. Others studied Fenrir with new respect, though fear sat heavy in their expressions. One delegate finally broke the silence, his voice trembling as he asked how humanity could control such a beast if it could unleash that kind of violence. Elias answered simply that Fenrir was not controlled but trusted, and that trust was the foundation of their bond. It was then that the leader of the hostile faction could bear no more. Rising from his seat, his body trembling with anger, he shouted that the council could not allow such creatures to sit in their sacred chambers. He called Fenrir a danger, a weapon disguised as a pet, and demanded that humanity be punished for bringing such a beast among them. His words carried desperation, and in his rage he stepped closer to Elias, pointing an accusing clawed hand. Fenrir rose slowly, not in a rush, but in deliberate motion. His body shifted from calm to tense, his ears pulling forward, his eyes locking, onto the figure advancing toward his human. The growl that rose from his chest this time was deeper than before, filled with warning that chilled the air itself. The chamber fell into complete silence as the sound vibrated through the walls. The leader froze mid-step, his arm still raised, his eyes widening as instinct told him to stop. He tried to laugh it off, tried to show strength, but the quiver in his voice betrayed him. Elias said nothing. He allowed Fenrir to stand as shield, and the silence pressed down until the leader retreated to his seat, his face pale and his voice lost. The rest of the chamber understood in that moment what words could not explain. Fenrir's loyalty was not only devotion, but power, a power that no threat could break, a power that gave humans an edge beyond comprehension. That night the whispers spread through every corner of the city and into the stars beyond. Merchants spoke of a dog that fought like a warrior. Soldiers whispered of loyalty so fierce that even assassins could not overcome it, and diplomats carried the tale to distant worlds. What had begun as laughter became murmurs of fear, and what had been dismissed as weakness now grew into a legend. The galaxy realized that if even the pets of humans fought with such determination, then humanity itself must carry within it a strength few could match. Elias sat by the window of his quarters. As the city lights glowed below, Fenrir resting at his feet, breathing slow and steady. The man's eyes watched the stars while his hand moved through the thick fur, feeling the calm heartbeat of his companion. He knew that the attack had changed everything. No longer was Fenrir just a curiosity in the eyes of the galaxy. He was, now, a warning. A single dog had shown the truth that weapons alone could not measure. Loyalty, trust, and love had proven stronger than blades and schemes. Fenrir stirred, his eyes opening to scan the room before closing again in trust. Elias whispered softly that they had made their point, but deep down he knew that this was only the beginning. The factions that hated humanity would not stop with one failed attempt. They had seen the bond between man and dog, and instead of learning respect, some would learn only fear, and fear had a way of turning into vengeance. The fight was not over. The fight had only been unleashed. Aftermath and fear. The halls of the council had changed. Where once the sound of mocking laughter had filled the air, now there was silence, heavy and uneasy. Delegates who had once jeered at Elias for bringing Fenrir into the chamber now avoided his eyes, their words reduced to hushed whispers when they thought he could not hear. The story of the night attack had spread far beyond the walls of the council. It traveled across the city into the ships that orbited above, and out into the endless stars where traders and soldiers and diplomats repeated the tale again and again. They spoke of a beast that fought like 10 soldiers, of a dog that would not let harm touch its master, and of a human who did not even need to command his companion because the bond between them was so strong. Elias knew this shift well. Where ridicule had once been a wall between him and the other species, now fear had begun to replace it. Some delegates looked at him with wide eyes when he passed, their bodies stiff with instinctive caution, as though they thought Fenrir might leap at them if they moved too quickly. Others tried to mask their fear with false courtesy, bowing their heads politely or offering quiet greetings that were never sincere. There were still a few who scoffed, still a few who muttered that humans were dangerous barbarians clinging to primitive beasts, but their voices were smaller now and carried less strength than before. Fenrir himself seemed unchanged. He still walked calmly beside Elias, his eyes steady, his breaths measured. Yet the atmosphere around him had shifted. Guards gave him wide space in the corridors. Servants paused in their duties to watch him pass, their eyes drawn not out of mockery, but out of respect mixed with fear. Even the chair of the council, who once demanded order through authority, now seemed careful in his words when addressing Elias and his companion. The factions that hated humanity did not give up, though they adjusted their methods. Instead of laughter, they now turned to whispers in shadowed corners. They spoke of danger, of how humanity could not be trusted if even their animals carried such power. They warned that if the council allowed humanity greater influence, then more of these creatures might walk among them, and more blood might follow. Some even suggested restrictions, that humans should be forced to leave their beasts behind when entering foreign worlds. But others, shaken by what they had heard, argued in private that perhaps such loyalty was exactly the kind of power the galaxy needed in a time of growing instability. Elias watched this change carefully. He did not celebrate the fear, for he knew it was fragile and dangerous. Fear could bring respect, but it could also bring hatred and violence. He stayed quiet in the chambers, speaking only when required, allowing Fenrir's silent presence to remind the delegates of what had happened. He did not need to boast, he did not need to argue, for the truth had already been written in the minds of all who had heard of the ambush. At night in his quarters, Elias thought of Earth, of the villages and cities where children played with dogs under warm skies, where families trusted these companions with their homes and their hearts. He thought of how natural it was for humans to live side by side with such creatures, how it was woven into the very soul of their history. Here in the stars, among alien empires and strange creatures, that simple truth had become something terrifying. He wondered if the galaxy would ever truly understand, or if they would forever see in Fenrir only the reflection of their own fear. Fenrir lay at his feet, his head resting on his paws, his ears twitching at distant sounds that Elias himself could not hear. There was no sign of violence in him now, only calm watchfulness. Yet Elias knew that if danger came again, the calm would shatter in an instant and the fury would return. That knowledge comforted him even as it frightened others. He reached down and stroked the thick fur, whispering softly that they had walked into history without meaning to. Outside in the city, the whispers continued. Merchants told stories that grew larger with every retelling. Some said Fenrir had killed a dozen assassins with a single strike. Others claimed his eyes glowed with fire when he fought. Children of alien species huddled together, daring one another to speak of the human beast in the halls of power. And across distant worlds, leaders who had never set foot in the council chamber began to wonder what humanity truly was, if even their pets could bring fear to the stars. The council could not hide from the truth any longer. Humanity was no longer a curiosity, no longer a fragile young species seeking approval. Humanity was a force that carried with it bonds unlike any other, bonds that transformed even an animal into something unstoppable. And though laughter had been the first response, it was fear that remained. Elias looked out of his window once, more at the glittering towers and the endless night sky beyond. He knew the story was not finished. The fear spreading now was only the beginning. What would come next depended not only on him, but on every human who carried such bonds with them into the galaxy. The galaxy had seen a glimpse of humanity's truth, and it could never go back to laughter again. The lesson learned. The council chamber felt heavier than it had in many cycles. The air seemed to press down on every delegate as Elias entered with Fenrir at his side. Where once there had been laughter or scorn, there was now silence, broken only by the soft rhythm of Fenrir's paws against the polished floor. The chair called for order, but order was already present, for no one dared interrupt the moment. The attempted attack had left wounds on the reputation of the council, and the whispers that spread across the stars had shaken the foundation of power. Now all eyes turned toward the human and the beast they had mocked. Elias stood tall, his hand brushing the fur at Fenrir's neck, his voice calm but firm as he addressed the assembly. He reminded them of their laughter, of how they had once called humanity weak for keeping companions by their sides. He reminded them of their words, of leashes and muzzles, of questions about courage. Then he spoke of the attack, of how assassins, armed with blades and hatred, had fallen not because of weapons or guards, but because a dog refused to let harm touch his master. He did not embellish, he did not raise his tone, but the silence of the chamber gave weight to every word. Some delegates bowed their heads, unable to meet his gaze. Others shifted uneasily, their instincts screaming that the beast beside him was no simple creature. Yet Elias did not speak to frighten them. He spoke to remind them of a truth humanity had always known. He told them that Fenrir was not a weapon, not a tool, not a servant. He was family. He was proof that love and loyalty could shape something stronger than fear. Fenrir sat calmly, his eyes scanning the chamber, his body still as stone. To the council, he looked like a predator resting, but to Elias he was simply the same companion, who had shared long nights of watch, the same dog who trusted him with everything. Elias lifted his hand and let it rest on Fenrir's head, and in that gesture, the chamber saw what words alone could not capture. They saw a bond forged not in violence but in trust, a connection so complete that no threat could sever it. One delegate finally rose, his voice low but steady. He admitted that the council had misunderstood. They had mistaken humanity's bonds for weakness when in truth, those bonds were a form of strength the galaxy could not match. He said that if a single dog could defend a man with such fury, then what would humanity itself unleash if its families or worlds were threatened? Murmurs followed his words, murmurs that carried fear, but also respect. The hostile faction tried one last time to resist. Their leader stood, his voice sharp as he warned that humanity was dangerous, that their presence in the council could bring chaos. But his words sounded hollow, for all knew he had been behind the failed attack. His protests only deepened the silence that followed. One by one, the other delegates turned their gaze away from him and back to Elias. Elias did not ask for fear, nor did he seek to threaten. He simply ended his speech with a single truth. He said that humanity's strength was not in ships or weapons, but in the loyalty they inspired, loyalty that made even beasts stand against blades. He said that if the galaxy mocked humanity for this, then it mocked the very thing that might one day protect them all. And then he sat down, and the chamber remained quiet. From that day forward, the laughter was gone. No one spoke of leashes or muzzles again. Instead, when Elias walked the corridors, delegates stepped aside, not out of mockery, but out of respect. Fenrir was no longer a curiosity. He was a legend, a living symbol of what humanity could bring to the stars. Stories spread far beyond the council. Tales of the dog that defended his human against assassins. Tales that grew into warnings told by soldiers and songs whispered by traitors. In the quiet of his quarters, Elias looked out at the stars with Fenrir resting at his feet. He knew the galaxy's view of humanity had changed forever. No longer were humans seen as fragile newcomers. Now they were recognized as a species that carried strength, not just in machines, but in the unbreakable bonds of loyalty and love. Fenrir lifted his head, ears twitching, and Elias smiled softly, whispering that they had done what words alone never could. They had shown the truth. The council would remember this day, and the galaxy would carry its lesson. Humanity was not weak. Humanity was not alone. And when threatened, even their so-called pets became protectors fierce enough to shake empires. Humanity's true face. The galaxy had always believed it understood strength. To the council, strength was measured in fleets of warships armed with plasma cannons, in armies that marched across planets with endless soldiers, in wealth counted in the trillions, and in the reach of empires that spanned hundreds of stars. Yet none of those things explained why a single man and a single dog had shaken their confidence so deeply. The council chamber had been a theater of laughter and ridicule, but now it had become a place of silence where every delegate watched, the human and his companion with guarded eyes. Elias had not come to frighten them. He had not come to boast of power or demand respect through fear. He had come to represent his people, and he had brought Fenrir not as a weapon but as proof of what made humanity different. The galaxy had seen that proof when assassins struck, and Fenrir unleashed his fury to protect the one he loved. The memory of that night lived in every whispered retelling, in every cautious look cast toward Elias as he walked the corridors, in every nervous silence when Fenrir's amber eyes swept across the chamber. But behind the fear, there was something else beginning to grow. A few delegates who were wise enough to see beyond their instinct whispered privately that perhaps humanity's way carried a lesson. They admitted that while their empires ruled through fear and through force, humanity ruled the hearts of their companions through loyalty and trust. They began to wonder what it would mean if such bonds could extend beyond dogs and humans, if entire species could learn from that strength. For the first time, the galaxy glimpsed that humanity's strange customs were not weakness, but another path to survival, one that made them dangerous not because of their weapons, but because of the devotion they inspired. Elias understood that not every mind would be changed. There would always be those who saw only threat in the bond between man and dog. There would always be factions that would plot and whisper in the shadows, waiting for another chance to strike. Yet he also knew that a seed had been planted, a truth that could not be buried again. The galaxy had seen what happened when a human was threatened and a dog stood to protect its owner, and no one would forget that lesson. As the days passed, and the council returned to its endless debates, Elias remained a quiet figure, speaking when needed, listening when others argued, always with Fenrir at his side. The dog's calm presence carried more weight than speeches, for every delegate knew what power rested in that silence. They knew that laughter had turned into fear, and fear into respect, and respect into something far harder to shake. One evening, Elias stood on a balcony high above the shining city. The stars stretched out like rivers of light across the night sky. Fenrir sat beside him, his fur ruffled gently by the breeze, his eyes watchful but calm. Elias rested his hand on the dog's neck and whispered that they had done more than survive. They had shown the galaxy the true face of humanity. Not conquerors, not victims, but beings who built bonds so deep that even predators chose love over blood, even in the darkest moments. The council would write laws and the factions would continue to scheme, but none of that mattered as much as the bond between man and dog. That bond had carried them through fire, through laughter, through violence, and it would carry them still into the endless future among the stars. Humanity was no longer the species mocked for weakness. Humanity was no longer the newcomer laughed at for strange customs. Humanity was now the species whose loyalty could shake empires and whose pets could defend worlds. Elias smiled faintly as Fenrir pressed against his leg, both of them watching the stars as if they already belonged to them. And in the silence of that night, the truth of humanity's place in the galaxy settled like stone. They were not weak. They were not to be mocked. They were a force unlike any other, and they had only just begun to show the galaxy what that meant. The end.